In the book of Daniel, if you will remember, at the end of our last study, we were looking at Daniel chapter 5, and we saw the end of the Babylonian kingdom described there. And Daniel lived through the entire period of 70 years during which the Babylonian kingdom was at its height. And Daniel was there to pronounce God's verdict of judgment on that kingdom of Babylon in the reign of Belshazzar and his father. Now all this was in fulfillment of the word of God which had been spoken through prophets in earlier years. I just want to tell you something about the geography of the region that we are considering. Babylon was the capital of that empire, and today it was also known as Mesopotamia, that area. And today it is what is known as the country of Iraq. Now, when you read the scriptures, you find that the Garden of Eden was located in this area at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Because we read in Genesis 2 that the river Euphrates flowed down the Garden of Eden, and that is in that area. And we also read later on in Genesis that Abraham's hometown, Ur of the Chaldees, was also in this area. And before Abraham was born, the Tower of Babel, which we read of in Genesis chapter 11, was built where Babylon was set up later on by Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, the Tower of Babel, the remnants of it, was right in the middle of the city of Babylon. So when God called Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, out from the idolatry of the Chaldees, and the Chaldees is another name for Babylonians. The Chaldeans are the Babylonians. He called Abraham out of the idolatry of the Chaldean nation, and he went past the Tower of Babel and Babylon and came into the land of Canaan to set up a nation there which would follow the true and living God. And one day when the descendants of Abraham became idolatrous themselves, God sent them back to the same area where their forefather Abraham came from, to Babylon. As it were to tell them, if you want to worship idols, I'll send you right back where I called your father out from. Now all this has spiritual symbolism. The early church that we read of in Acts chapter 2, like Abraham, was called out of a Babylonian religion. The Jewish religion had become Babylonian in spirit when Jesus came, particularly being headed up by the Pharisees. And the early church, like Abraham, came out of that Babylonian system and set up a powerful church that we read of in the Acts of the Apostles, pure and powerful. But through the centuries, just like the nation of Israel, the church degenerated spiritually, and so God sent the church back into a Babylonian captivity, just like He sent the Jews into a Babylonian captivity. He says, you can go back to where I called your forefathers out from. And it is from this Babylonian captivity that we read that Daniel was the beginning of a movement back to Jerusalem. And that also has spiritual symbolism for the days in which we live, that God is calling people out of Babylonian Christianity to be part of His bride, to be part of His true church, His body. And in the destruction of the Babylonian kingdom here, we have a picture of that final destruction of religious Babylon that we read of in Revelation 17 and 18. I just want to show you a few Old Testament verses that prophesied the destruction of Babylon. 175 years before, in the prophecy of Isaiah, 175 years before Babylon was destroyed. In Isaiah 21, the Lord prophesied through Isaiah. Isaiah 21 verse 2, a harsh vision has been shown to me. The treacherous one still deals treacherously, and the destroyer still destroys. Go up, Elam. Elam is another word for Persia. Lay siege, Media. This is the joint kingdom of Media and Persia, which is the second world empire that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. And this is the empire that finally crushed the Babylonians. But it's amazing how 175 years earlier, when Media and Persia were not a kingdom at all, God prophesied through Isaiah saying, go up, Persia and Media, and go up to conquer. And the result of it is described in verse 9. Now behold, here comes a troop of riders, horsemen in pairs. One answered, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of our gods are shattered on the ground. God raises up one kingdom to punish another. God raised up the Babylonians to punish the Jews. And when the Babylonians got puffed up, God raised up the Medo-Persians to punish the Babylonians. And that's how it's been all through the history of the world. God is in charge of history. Another amazing thing we see in the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 44. All this is 175 years before it actually happened. Verse 26. Confirming the word of his servant and performing the purpose of his messengers, it is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built. Now Isaiah said this at a time when Jerusalem was not yet destroyed. He was speaking about something that was going to happen 100 years later, when Jerusalem would be destroyed, and another 70 years after that, when Jerusalem would be built again. He's talking about something that's going to happen well into the future. I will raise up her ruins again. But Jerusalem was not in ruins when Isaiah prophesied that. That was something that was going to happen in the future. And that had to take place only after the Jews were in captivity for 70 years. And that was the period of the Babylonian kingdom. But the Babylonians were not going to send the Jews back to Jerusalem. So what was God going to do? God was going to destroy the Babylonian kingdom and raise up another kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom, headed up by a man called Cyrus, who would send the Jews back to Jerusalem. And that's what we read in verse 28. It is I who says of Cyrus. Cyrus was the head of the Medo-Persian army that destroyed Babylon that night. And he appointed Darius, his uncle, who was a Mede, Cyrus himself was a Persian, to be the ruler over that Babylonian kingdom. But Cyrus was the leader. And it's amazing how Isaiah prophesied the name of the man who was going to destroy Babylon 175 years before he actually did it. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform my desire. If the Babylonians don't do it, all right, I'll destroy them. I'll raise up somebody else who will do it. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built. And of the temple, your foundation will be laid. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed. It's amazing how God uses the word anointed. Anointed for a particular purpose. What was that? That he would be the instrument in God's hand to make the Jewish people come back into his land. It's very similar to how in 1948 the United Nations became an instrument in God's hand to vote in favor of Israel coming back and occupying that land again. It's happened in our generation. Well, 2,500 years ago it happened once before as well, when the Lord said to Cyrus, it's very interesting to read this, I have taken him by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and notice this phrase, to loose the loins of kings. And that's exactly what we read in Daniel chapter 5, that when Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, his loins were loosed. It's amazing, an exact fulfillment of that prophecy. And to open the doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. You remember in our last study I told there were sluice gates in the river Euphrates where it went through the city of Babylon, and those gates were opened by Cyrus as he came through the river into the city by diverting the river outside, and he came in, and the Lord used him, verse 2, to shatter the doors of bronze and cut through their iron bars, and he came and occupied. Now I want to show you another verse, Jeremiah chapter 27. This was prophesied 70 years earlier. Jeremiah was the last prophet before Israel went into the Babylonian captivity. And Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah 27. And notice this exact fulfillment. Verse 6, Jeremiah 27:6. The Lord says, I've given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. He calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. And in that sense, all the people in the world who are in authority, Romans 13:1-5, says they are all servants of God. Not servants of God in the sense of proclaiming His word, but servants in the sense that they have to fulfill God's purpose. And all the authorities in the world, though the devil may have put them in those places, in one sense they are servants of God in the sense that they serve God's purposes. And I have given him all the wild animals to serve him. And listen to this, verse 7. All the nations will serve him, his son, that is Nabonidus, and his grandson, that is Belshazzar. And with his grandson, that will be the end of the Babylonian kingdom. Until the time of his own land comes, then many nations and great kings will make him, that is Babylon, their servant. So you see, God had specified, after Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to be his son and his grandson. Daniel knew that. When Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar was on the throne, Daniel knew this is the last king, and Medo-Persia is going to take over. And so we see an exact fulfillment of prophecy, what we see in Daniel chapter 5. When the handwriting came on the wall, that was the end of that kingdom, prophesied by Isaiah and Jeremiah. Now, turning back to Daniel chapter 5, there's just one more thing I want to point out there before we move on to chapter 6. And just by the way, this is something very interesting. The Babylonian kingdom was there, and the Medo-Persian kingdom came to fight against it. In today's names for these countries, do you know what the Babylonian kingdom is? Iraq, and the Medo-Persian kingdom is Iran. It was Iran versus Iraq, just like it is in our day. It's amazing how the river Euphrates is a center of conflict, as we read in the book of Revelation chapter 16 as well. In the last days, there's going to be conflict around the river Euphrates before the coming of Christ. And we see the fulfillment of prophecy in our day, and there was a fulfillment of it earlier when Iran overpowered Iraq in Daniel chapter 5. The one other thing I want to point out here is that verse 25, I spoke about the handwriting on the wall. And I just want to tell you the meaning of these words. Mene, Tekel, and Peres, mentioned in verse 26 to 28 of chapter 5 of Daniel. Mene, Tekel, and Peres. The interesting thing I want to point out to you, it's mentioned in the margin of the Bible here in the NASB. All these words relate to money. Mene means 50 shekels. And that's how you get the word numbered. Numbered. Tekel means shekel. That is 1 shekel. That's relating to money too. That means weighed, an exact weight. And Peres means half a shekel. That is to divide the shekel into 2. Now it's very interesting that God wrote on the wall of this palace 3 words, all of which related to money. Why was that? Because this is how religious Babylon is built even today. It is through unfaithfulness in money, an unrighteous attitude to money, and a love of money and of material things that Christianity degenerates into a Babylonian version of it. And if a man has not conquered the power of money and the love of money in his life, whatever knowledge he may have of the scriptures, he will only ultimately end up building Babylon. And it is impossible for a full-time Christian worker who has not been freed from the love of money ever to build Jerusalem, the true church of Christ. This is why we speak so much against it. I just mentioned that the handwriting on the wall against Babylon was money, money, money. And what were they doing when Babylon was destroyed? Entertainment, 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 entertainment. That's the other thing you see in Babylonian Christianity. Money and entertainment. And that's why the judgment of God comes upon it. The church is not a place to make money. It's not a place for entertainment. Christianity is not for entertainment. It's serious business. Christianity is not meant to be a means of earning a living or making profit. I just mentioned that in passing. Now we come to chapter 6, verse 1. It says here, it seemed good to Darius. Now listen, this is the new king appointed by Cyrus, the leader. Darius has been appointed over this whole Babylonian kingdom, and we would have thought that he should have sacked all these leaders of Babylon, of which Daniel was at the head. But he didn't do it. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps, that is, sort of governors over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them 3 commissioners on top of these governors, and Daniel was one. That these satraps might be accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. Were people who collected the revenue. And then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, or an excellent spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Here was a man who was a captive in a sense, but his work and his spirit was so excellent that the king that conquered the country recognized him as worthy of being appointed over the whole kingdom because of his uprightness and his faithfulness. Now I want to tell you something. Daniel came into Babylon when he was 17, and approximately, and by the time the Medo-Persians took over 70 years later, he was 87 years old. But at 87, he's just as upright and just as faithful as he was 70 years earlier. I tell you, there are very few people in the Christian ministry who endure till the end like that. An outstanding example. When Darius appointed Daniel, he was 87 years old. And he excelled himself, which must have been over a period of time. So what we read in Daniel chapter 6 is something that took place when Daniel was approximately 90 years old. Think of this. He's an old man now. But it hasn't made any difference to his spirit. And it says here that Daniel was going to be appointed over the whole kingdom, which shows God's sovereignty. God had a purpose for Daniel to fulfill. And I believe that God needed Daniel to influence Cyrus to send the Jews back to Jerusalem. We read here in the end of chapter 6, verse 28, Daniel 6:28, Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now with this in mind, I want you to turn to a verse in the book of Ezra in the Old Testament, Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1. The book of Ezra describes the movement of God's people back to Jerusalem from Babylon. That's the subject of the book of Ezra. And the very first verse of the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 1, reads like this. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, saying, Thus says the king of Persia, Cyrus, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people. Which people? The true God's people. And I ask this question, where did Cyrus learn about that? He didn't learn it from Persia, I'll tell you that. History tells us that when Cyrus was king of Persia, there was a great religious leader in Persia called Zoroaster. Zoroaster was the founder of the Parsi religion, and he was there during the reign of Cyrus. And do you know what Zoroaster means? Zoroaster means the seed of the woman. That's what he called himself, the seed of the woman, the Messiah. But amazing that this man, Cyrus, knew that the true God was not the one Zoroaster preached about. Who influenced him? It must have been only Daniel. It's amazing what one man could do for God during those 70 years. That's a challenge to us. It's not numbers by which God does His work, but by one wholehearted, upright person. It's amazing. God's tremendous purposes for His people were fulfilled. And He says, let him go up to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. It's amazing. And he goes on to say in that book how Cyrus helped them with money and property and all types of things to build God's house in Jerusalem. So we see the influence of Daniel.